All right, we're good, Connie.
Okay, and I have this meeting is being recorded, so can I just hit continue? If I can get my cursor to find it. Yeah, okay, so all set? Okay, so welcome everybody. Today I am sharing with you some plants of Shakespeare. And Shakespeare really was a country boy. He was born in 1564 in Stratford-upon-Avon. And this, you see the map here. Stratford is in Warwickshire, which is considered the Midlands of England. And again, he was in existence during the Elizabethan period, and that would be Queen Elizabeth I. And Warwickshire was really countryside, and Stratford, even though he was born in Stratford, it was a very small market town when he was living there. And so he would have been very familiar, not just with a small town, but with the countryside that surrounded it. You had the Avon River, you had the Forest of Arden, there were meadows, there were certainly livestock that were raised, so there'd be pasture land, crops were grown, so he would have been familiar with farm fields. So it really was an area that, again, countryside was very much part of his upbringing, because not only was he born there, but he was raised there. And his parents, his father was a glove maker, so they would have had gardens, but also livestock. They raised cows and sheep, and I believe that Shakespeare assisted with tanning and probably also assisted his father on market days to sell the gloves and the leather work that his father was known for. Both sets of grandparents were farmers. So again, he would have had exposure to farming and farming techniques. Well, he spent about 10 years in London, and that was when he was prolific with his writing. And so he would have been familiar with a more urban landscape, although 1500s, how urban are we talking? But London still was bigger than Stratford. He also would have been familiar with palace gardens, with royal gardens, because his plays were performed for the Queen. And the Queen did not come to the theater. You took the play to the Queen. That was the way it was done. And so certainly he would have been at palaces and been at royal residences and seen the things that would be grown there. Now, in his early 30s, he returned to Stratford. And again, over that 10-year period, even though he resided in London, he returned to Stratford very often. But he returned permanently in his early 30s when he bought New Place. And that was his home. He had a home in Gardens, and he lived there until his death in 1616. So when you figure the majority of his life was spent in the countryside, he really was a country boy. And I know that he was referred to as upstart crow, meaning that he was, he was a hick. He really wasn't a city boy by any means. Now, gardens were very popular in Elizabethan times. So it's not just the Shakespeare family that had gardens. The house I have pictured here is actually Henley Street in Stratford, and this is where Shakespeare was born and raised. And the gardens that his parents would have kept would have had flowers, vegetables, and fruit. And flowers were not just grown to be ornamental, not just for their appearance and their scent, but they were used for a variety of purposes. They also would have grown herbs, and again, those were used for cooking, but also medicinally. Using plants medicinally was very big and very mainstream in Elizabethan England. Most gardens would have an arbor. You would grow something, a climbing plant over it, because it provided you with a spot for shade. And as a gardener, I appreciate having a shady spot to sit after I've been working out in the sun. So again, those covered walkways or covered seating places with arbors, very common in Elizabethan gardens. But also, people of that time frame, their gardens could consist of pastures and crop fields and orchards. We know Shakespeare had fruit trees all his life. I don't know if they had a full orchard, but again, familiar with fruit trees and things that you would grow for eating. It's also interesting that Elizabethan gardens also had a lot of plants who were not native to England. This time period was one where the Elizabethans were very interested in exotic plants and plants brought in from other lands. And so they would have also been growing things that were not native species to England. Now, Shakespeare, we know, was a prolific writer. Some people may argue that he didn't write all these things, but today we're going to assume he did. And so he was responsible for writing 39 plays, 154 sonnets, and 2 long narratives. And in those writings, there are over 170 references to plants, and not just individual plants, but to gardening techniques. So you'll see references to weeding, to planting, to harvesting. And it made it very apparent that Shakespeare knew about growing seasons. He knew when things came into bloom or when they were ripe, and he knew when they would fade and no longer be in existence. So he understood the life cycle of plants too. And that, again, was referenced in his work. And I hope you like this, to garden or not to garden. And again, we don't say Shakespeare was a gardener, but he was certainly influenced and aware of plants. How did Shakespeare use plants, or how were they referenced in his work? Well, many times scent certainly was at the forefront. And he would not only mention pleasant aromas of plants. You see a lot of reference to sweet. He mentions roses and violets as having a sweet scent. But he also will mention when things are not so pleasant. He mentions in some of his writing about lilies, and how when lilies start to decay, it is a very unpleasant smell. And so he did reference that in his works. Certainly appearance comes into play, the appearance of the plant, but many times too, he will liken the appearance of a plant to a person, to their lips, to their face, to their complexion. So there's that type of reference going on. Emotional response can be seen in his works. How do you feel when you look at this plant? Does it produce calmness and serenity? Is it loaded with thorns, so it's partially dangerous? It has hidden danger. Do you get angry? Do you feel shame? You know, is the color of the plant, does that influence your feelings? So those all are part of how he writes about plants. Symbolism too, and I mentioned how he symbolically will liken a plant, its appearance, to a person. He'll also use symbolism to equate a plant and its growing season to a person's life. So a lot of times spring plants will reference youth for Shakespeare. But also the monarchy and the royalty comes heavily into play in his works, using plants symbolically. And I'll talk about that in just a few minutes. Folklore, probably my favorite way that Shakespeare references plants, because Elizabethan times were a time when they believed in fairies and witches and superstition and potions and spells and hexes. All those things were part of Shakespeare's time and certainly incorporated into his writings. So you get a heavy duty lump of folklore when you read Shakespeare. And plants are also referenced for their utility. And I did mention that you would have been growing fruits and vegetables and herbs for consumption, for cooking, but also they were very much mainstream to use as medicine. They were used medicinally. And there were two major influences on Shakespeare that would have given the knowledge of how plants are used for medicine. And that was two physicians that we believe influenced him. One was a man named John Gerard. John Gerard would have been a neighbor of Shakespeare's in London. He was a very prominent and respected physician. He wrote the Herbal in 1597, and it documented all the ways plants could be utilized as medicine. And they were used not just for internal medicines, but also how to make salves and ointments with them. He talked about herbs that could be used to counter poison, to treat skin rashes, even to ward off plague. I don't know how well that one worked, but it was something that he promoted through the use of herbs and plants. The other physician, a little closer to home for Shakespeare, John Hall. This was his son-in-law. John Hall was married to Shakespeare's daughter, Susanna, and he practiced medicine in Stratford. So he was not London-based, he was actually in Stratford. And he very diligently recorded and kept track of all the people that he treated and what he treated them with. And he also was very much an advocate for using plant-based medication. So again, it wasn't something that was considered far-fetched. It was very mainstream at the time to use plants medicinally. Now, if you and I lived in Elizabethan times and we weren't doctors and we started putting all these things together, we would have been accused of witchcraft. So it was a fine line that was drawn on using plants as medication. But the physicians, they were mainstream and they had full permission to do this. Now I want to talk about some of the plants. I certainly won't go into all of them because there are a boatload when you've got over 170 references, and some are repeated. And this is like roses. Roses, Shakespeare mentions over 70 times in his work, and not just appearance and scent, number of ways that I talked about the referencing. But roses, again, were not grown just to be ornamental and beautiful and to sit on a shelf. They were used for cooking, preserving. People made perfumes out of roses, rose water and rose oil, cosmetics. They used them for laundering, medicines, remedies, and of course, magic. You remember, this is fairies and witches' time, so they could be used for love potions and for spells. And again, John Hall, Dr. Hall, his son-in-law, in his writings mentioned over 60 uses for roses. And again, that would have been medicinally for using roses. Now, this is probably my favorite quote, and I have to admit, roses are my favorite. I absolutely love them. Of all flowers, methinks a rose is best. So that is, I think that captures how Shakespeare felt. I think it certainly captures how I feel and many other people. And scent, again, predominant in his writings about roses. Certainly the most famous line, I think we all had to memorize this in school. What's in a name? That which we call a rose by any other name would smell as sweet, from Romeo and Juliet. And from the sonnet, it talks about how the rose looks fair, but fairer we it deem for that sweet odor which doth in it live. So the idea that, yes, it's beautiful, but what's even more lovely is that it has this wonderful scent. Appearance also comes into play when he talks about roses. If you look down to the third quote, their lips were 4 red roses on a stalk, from Richard III. So again, many times he'll take a flower and liken it to a person's complexion or appearance in some way, or a body part. I'll say she looks as clear as morning roses newly washed with dew, from Taming of the Shrew. And remember, this was an attempt to tame Kate. So he's going to tell her anything, no matter what she says. He's going to tell her how beautiful she is. And Shakespeare mentions dew and morning flower appearance a great deal. I think he found it very lovely, and it's so apparent when you read some of his plays and some of his sonnets that he really did love roses, and he loved that early morning effect of dew on the flowers. I mentioned symbolism before, and how Shakespeare will symbolically compare a flower to a person, either their life cycle or their appearance or their behavior. But it also figured prominently when we talk about the monarchy, and in particular about the Tudor Rose. I have here both the illustration and an actual Tudor Rose. And this references back to the War of the Roses, which occurred in 1455. Well, certainly Shakespeare wasn't alive for the War of the Roses, but it was a significant piece of English history. And basically the War of the Roses pitted 2 vying houses, the House of York and the House of Lancaster, against one another, vying for the crown. It began in 1455. It was considered a civil war, and it lasted over 30 years in England. So a great deal of battle and bloodshed for the crown. And it only ended because of the merger of the 2 houses with the marriage of Henry VII. So you had the House of York, represented by the White Rose, and the House of Lancaster, or the House of the Tudors, represented by the Red Rose. And it was with this merger that then it's the monarchy, the Tudor Rose. And so it again was a very important part of English history, and very significant change for the monarchy. Now, again, it was over 100 years from the War of the Roses and Shakespeare's birth. So obviously he did not live through this, and he was not in the Temple Garden to hear the speech. He wrote about it, and in essence, he made it up. Imagine this is how it could have happened. And in this scene from Henry VI, there are representatives from both the House of York and the House of Lancaster, and they are each trying to gain allegiance. And they are asking individuals to pluck a petal from one rose or the other to show what house they are going to pledge their allegiance to. And so this quote is from the Earl of Warwick in Henry VI, basically saying, okay, it's going to get bad now. And what he says is, this brawl today, grown to this faction in the Temple Garden, shall send between the red rose and the white 1,000 souls to death and deadly night. So it marks the start of a very, very difficult period in England. And again, Shakespeare didn't witness it firsthand, but he captured it here, I think, beautifully and symbolically with the rose. Now, Shakespeare mentions at least 3 different kinds of roses specifically in his writings. And we know these would have been roses he would have had exposure to and probably grew on his properties. One is the musk rose or a rambling rose, and the second is an eglantine or sweet briar rose. And the white rose that I have pictured here is the musk rose. The eglantine sweet briar is the one on the bottom, the pink rose. Musk roses were not native. They were probably brought to England in the 11th century, but they became very commonplace in English gardens because they smelled beautiful. They were a lovely rose, and they were especially very scented at night. So a lot of the references will be to how these smell at night. And I think anybody that grows roses, if they're scented at night, especially in the summertime, it's very exotic. It can be very sensual and exotic, these scents at night. The eglantine, again, was a native rose, and that was considered a wild rose at the time with Shakespeare, and grew probably all over Warwickshire, certainly at his properties. And it was known both for its scent and for its rose hips. And again, they would use those rose hips probably to brew tea and to do a number of culinary things with, also medicinally. But what is probably even more important is the eglantine or sweet briar is a symbol for the queen. The queen adopted this as a symbol of her and her reign. And so the sweet briar stands for royalty and chastity. And we know Queen Elizabeth I was a virgin queen. And so this rose represented the queen also. The third rose that Shakespeare was very fond of and is mentioned directly in his writings is the damask rose. And this rose, again, not a native, brought from Syria. It is used in the perfume industry. So rose water and perfume is derived from this rose. It's heavily scented and just a beautiful rose, a large rose. I picture it here in pink because it was usually pink, but Shakespeare makes reference to it as being red and as white. And just a gorgeous rose, and grown in English gardens, in those Elizabethan gardens. Now, Sonnet 130, I encourage you all to read it because I think it takes an interesting turn. Here he says, I have seen roses damasked red and white, but no such roses see I in her cheeks. In essence, he's saying, I've seen beautiful roses in these colors, but my love doesn't have a nice complexion. That's basically what he's saying. And the whole sonnet talks about how imperfect she is, making comparisons to a number of things. I assume he still loves her, but that she is far from perfect. And this is just one of the ways that he demonstrates that, because he holds these roses in such high esteem. From the winter's tale, lawn as white as driven snow, cypress black as air was crow, gloves as sweet as damask roses. I wonder if this is kind of a tie back to the fact that his father was a successful glove maker and he assisted in the business. And when you think of how soft some gloves are, some leather gloves, he's referencing that to these beautiful roses. And I couldn't end talking about roses without mentioning the rose that I want so desperately in my yard. And it's called the William Shakespeare 2000 rose. And it's a David Austin English rose. If anybody is familiar with David Austin, he was an English breeder. I guess you'd say rose breeder. And basically his quest was to take old English roses, which are known for that beautiful kind of cabbage rose shape. They're heavenly scented. It's an old rose scent, but a lot of these old rose varieties are very prone to disease. And so it was his quest as a rose guru to keep these wonderful factions that we want, the size, the shape, the colors, and the scent, but to have something more resilient to disease. And so that's what he did in these cultivars. And this one is actually a shrub rose. It has many blossoms on a single stem. It's a repeat bloomer, and it has this kind of red to purple tone, and it has an old rose fragrance. So if anybody finds one, please let me know, because I think they are no longer available. And I've even checked the David Austin site and catalog. So if you ever see one, talk to me. I would be happy to do business with you. Now, beyond roses, many other plants, remember 170 references. Honeysuckle, which Shakespeare was also called woodbine. Honeysuckle was very prized and loved. I know now we see it as invasive, and maybe the type they had wasn't invasive, but it was grown for scent and also because it was a pretty hardy climber. And so all those arbors that Elizabethans had in their yard, this was a go-to to grow on those arbors to create a kind of shaded area. From A Midsummer Night's Dream, our quote, quite over canopied with luscious woodbine. And again, we know how beautiful scented honeysuckle is, especially at night. Steal into the pleach bower where honeysuckles ripened by the sun forbid the sun to enter, from Much Ado About Nothing. And a pleach bower is a trimmed hedge. And so they would trim the honeysuckle. And again, it needs the sun to grow, but then provides a very shady undercarriage. And Shakespeare didn't just see these as places to get out of the sun. When he wrote about them, they might be a secret place for a confrontation or for romantic interludes. So again, you had these shady, hidden places with this wonderful, intoxicating scent. Honeysuckle for the Elizabethans also had a symbolic edge to it where it stood for faithfulness and affection. So that would make sense also with those kind of romantic interludes under this canopy of luscious woodbine. Believe it or not, marigolds were plentiful in Elizabethan gardens. And again, not native from Mexico, but they were grown primarily to use for medicine. So marigolds would have been made into a paste or an ointment to use on minor skin injuries, but they also used them to help with bruises and sprains. I don't know how that went, but that's how they were prescribed by the doctors. And they would also eat marigolds. They would be used in broths and salads, but primarily seen as a medicinal go-to for Elizabethans. Now here, the marigold that goes to bed with the sun and with him rises weeping is referencing the morning dew on this flower that looks like the sun. And winking marybuds begin to ope their golden eyes. And a marybud is a marigold, but also references a symbolic of the Virgin Mary in Elizabethan times. So if you grow marigold, Shakespeare would love you, right? This one I find wonderful. Carnations, pinks, and gillivores. And a gillivore or a gilliflower is a carnation or a pink. And gilly is a Latin reference to the clove scent of these flowers. And so they would have called anything with a clove scent a gillivore or a gilliflower. And obviously, he paid tribute to them and liked them. If you look at this quote, "Sir, the year growing ancient, not yet on summer's death, nor on the birth of trembling winter. The fairest flowers of the season are our carnations and streaked gillivores." Now, the bottom quote actually is in reference to pinks. And it says the very pink of courtesy. And pink was the equivalent of being perfect. So they must have felt these flowers were just beautiful and perfect, because the very pink of courtesy means perfect manners. Now they did use carnations to make wine, but also these were the plague preventive medication. So you would mull them in hot wine and it would help keep you from the plague. Again, did it work? We'll never know. But it was, again, a mainstream treatment prescribed by physicians of the time. Violets are mentioned frequently by Shakespeare, and these would have been naturalized growing wild flowers in Warwickshire. Remember, he's our country boy, so he would have seen these every spring. And they're also called sweet violets, English violets, garden violets, and a lot of different names for them. As I mentioned here, a symbol of faithfulness and fidelity, always alluding to spring, but also to youth, because he always would use the flowers to be able to emphasize a person's life cycle. And of course, we got to have magic in there, so they would have been used for love potions. Just some of the quotes. Again, he references scent and springtime with these. I think one of my favorites is the second one. To throw perfume on the violet is wasteful and ridiculous excess, because they're perfect as they are. You only make it worse by trying to add more fragrance to it. So you can see that he really thought these were wonderful. The bottom quote is from Hamlet, and it surrounds Ophelia's death. From her fair and unpolluted flesh may Violet spring. So again, mentioning spring and maybe a sense of rebirth. She had such a tragic end and a tragic life that this would be something of purity and something that would be something good, maybe the only thing good coming of her untimely death. Other spring flowers are mentioned frequently, daffodils. And again, daffodils would have been abundant in Warwickshire. He would have grown up seeing these. John Gerard, the first physician I mentioned that wrote the herbal, mentions there are over a dozen varieties of daffodils at that time in Elizabethan England. And he always ties them into spring. And I think he likes spring. When you see the second quote, he talks about, then comes in the sweet of the year, when these daffodils are blossoming. Daffodils that come before the swallow dares take the winds of March with beauty. So again, that wonderful picture of those first flowers that are blossoming in these meadows full of daffodils. Primrose, oxlip, and I have to mention, although I don't have it here, Shakespeare quotes many times about cowslips, which are all related. They're all related. The oxlip here is on the right. It's a much more sturdy wildflower. But again, we're talking about the countryside and where he would have seen them just in abundancy. I love From Midsummer Night's Dream because it's magical and there are fairies everywhere. And in the wood, where often you and I upon faint primrose beds were wont to lie. Or this quote over and over with the flowers, I know a bank where the wild thyme blows, where oxlips and the nodding violet grows. So they were abundant and they would have been seen everywhere by him, and especially more springtime. Lady Smock and Cuckoo Bud. Now, Lady Smock is the one that appears to be white. In reality, it isn't. It is a pale pink or lavender, and you see the cuckoo bud of yellow hue. The quote from Love's Labor's Lost, Lady Smocks all silver white and cuckoo buds of yellow hue do paint the meadows with delight. And I hope I'm quoting this correctly because my head is over some of my quotations. So if I do it wrong, correct me. The Lady Smock is actually, as I said, pink or lavender, pale color. But when you see them from a distance, and there's a whole field of them, and again, they're a wildflower, they appear silvery white. And why they called them lady smocks is because it was the habit of women in doing laundry in Elizabethan times, and a smock or an apron, or women would wear chemises, which are the kind of long white nightgown underneath corsets and outer clothing. They would wash them and they would lay them out on hedges to dry. And many times they'd lay them out on lavender hedges, so there'd be a wonderful scent on them. But Shakespeare must have had this memory from childhood to see all these smocks and aprons lying out, and they would look like the lady smock. And so that's what they were called. Cuckoo buds, again, were called cuckoo buds during Elizabethan times. If you see this picture, you may recognize it as a wildflower. I think it's a noxious weed because they took over my yard once, but it's a buttercup. But they weren't called buttercups for at least another 100 years. So these were cuckoo buds. And really any flower that would blossom in April was called a cuckoo bud or a cuckoo flower. And it was because that was a time when the bird, the cuckoo, returned to England and they would hear its call. So any April flower could be referenced as a cuckoo flower or cuckoo bud. And I have more appreciation for them now because they're in Shakespeare, but I still don't want to grow them anymore. Johnny jump ups, and why I've labeled them this way is because Shakespeare calls them pansies, but they're not the pansies we're familiar with. These great big blossom head pansies did not exist during Shakespeare's time. So they were these little delicate wildflowers, and they had many names that are attributed to them. Wild pansies, hearties, love and idleness, tickle my fancy, three faces under a hood. They're also called love and vain, and they were symbolic of forsaken love or foolish love or lost love. These were all how they were viewed, even by Elizabethans, not just by Shakespeare. So you see here the second quote. The first one's from Hamlet. It's Ophelia speaking, but I think the second one captures more how these were viewed, these pansies or little Johnny jump ups. Yet marked I where the bolt of Cupid fell. It fell upon a little western flower, before milk white, now purple with love's wound, and maidens call it love and idleness. So again, it's that kind of heart-stabbing, maybe first love that leaves you so forlorn and so heartbroken. And that's why it was called love and idleness or love in vain, because it wasn't good fruition from this love. Herbs are mentioned many times by Shakespeare. Chamomile is one of them. And I think this quote, and this is Falstaff from Henry IV, and he's doing a compare and contrast. If you trod on chamomile, it's going to grow more vigorously. It's going to like that, and it's going to do better. Where he talks about youth, and if you're too crazy in your youth, you're spent before your time, you're old before your time. And so this is a contrast. Chamomile likes that abuse, youth doesn't. It goes real bad for you if you do it. So obviously Shakespeare knew about also growing traits of plants and what would benefit them and what wouldn't. Thyme again, here's that quote again, I love it. I know a bank where the wild thyme blows. Thyme was very favored by Elizabethans because the bees loved thyme. And the Elizabethans certainly would use honey, they would make mead. When women embroidered, a lot of embroidery that was done in tapestry by women in Elizabethan times, and anytime they embroidered a bee, they would always embroider a sprig of thyme next to it because they felt they were so intertwined, those two things. Thyme was enjoyed for the scent. It was utilized for cooking. Also, it was stood for sweetness, and not just the bees loved thyme. They believed the fairies loved thyme. And so of course you had to have thyme for the fairies. Two other herbs I just want to mention briefly, rosemary and rue. Rosemary, again, would be used for cooking, but it was affiliated with remembrance, and primarily remembrance of the dead. That is how it was referenced. It also could stand symbolically for friendship and for fidelity. Now, it was used also medicinally. I don't know if any of these things work, but I don't think it'll hurt for you to consume rosemary to try. It's supposed to help baldness, tooth decay, and ease your nightmares. So I encourage you to try it because I don't think it's going to hurt you and see if any of that works. it might. I wish my husband had tried this, but he's very bald now. I don't think there's any going back. Otherwise, I would have fed him rosemary for years. When we talk about rue is the herb of grace. So in the second quote, when they talk about rosemary and rue, grace and remembrance be to you both. It is also associated with repentance and forgiveness. It's a bitter herb. It's a strong, got a strong aroma. I've always heard of it being toxic, so I can't say I would want to consume it, but John Gerard, one of our prominent physicians, he prescribed it, taking the seeds in wine to work as a counter poison. So he actually would prescribe it if somebody got into toxic mushrooms, if they got into wolf's bane or hen's bane, or if they had a bee or wasp sting. And again, did it work? I wouldn't try it personally. I really wouldn't. And I don't think I'd go trying to eat toxic mushrooms to see if it works. But again, it was used as a counter poison at that time. Now, again, we could go for hours because there are so many more plants that he mentions. Weeds come into prominence with Shakespeare. Many times they're entwined, like stinging nettle is entwined in crowns. And usually it means a forlorn or kind of unfortunate character. For instance, Ophelia has a crown of weeds that she wears. He mentions toxic plants quite frequently, nightshade and wolfsbane, hemlock and yew. And those, of course, are more going to be in the plays that talk about witches and poisons and spells. Trees come into play. Crab apples are mentioned a great deal because they ate them and they mulled wine from them. Herbs, more herbs. I encourage you all to use lavender. The Elizabethans would have used it for bathing, for laundry, and to see ghosts. So you have that nice side to it. And flowers, again, wildflowers and cultivated. So daisies, lilies, columbine, and iris all enter in. Now, I mentioned Shakespeare doesn't just mention individual flowers, but he talks about nature in general. And I think these show that he loved nature and he loved plants. One touch of nature makes the whole world kin. Bottom quote, our bodies are our gardens to which our wills are gardeners. And my favorite that I think shows the love of nature we as gardeners have. And this our life, exempt from public haunt, finds tongues in trees, books in the running brooks, sermons in stones, and good in everything. So that is Plants of Shakespeare. References I would mention to you, and of course, this is always what I have to do too. The allergy season is upon me. Number of articles that you can find that talks about predominant plants in Shakespeare's writing. I recommend these two books, Shakespeare's Flowers by Jessica Kerr. Not only mentions quotes, but how flowers would have been used by Elizabethans and what was important to Shakespeare. And Shakespeare's Gardens is a delight because not only does it mention Elizabethan times, but it specifically references Shakespeare's homes, both how they would have been when he was alive and how they're being restored now for the public. So Henley Street is in there, Anne Hathaway's farm and garden, and also New Place. So beautifully, beautiful photographs and really just a delightful book. So I encourage you all to explore those if you want to learn more about just how he lived and the importance of plants in his life. So thank you. I have a number of slides now about upcoming programs. I could let Jan take it from here if she'd like to, or if there's questions.
Yeah, we'll do the slides, Connie, and then we'll open up to questions. So we do have Garden Talk is the first Thursday of the month. And in April, we're doing Spring into the Garden. We're hoping to be able to go back to live in person and also Zoom. So I know some of you can't get here, but we're going to try and do both. Stay tuned. Do you want to do the next slide? And all of our programs are, as we get the registration information ready, it is up on our CCE website in events. And our Master Gardener office is open Monday through Friday, 10 to noon. Master Gardeners are here in the office, and you can call, email, stop in. bring a plant sample, have a question. They're here to help you, anything garden related. And you can find us on our Facebook page, YouTube, our CC website. For those of you who registered, I will send you an email when we have Connie's fascinating program up on YouTube, probably early next week.
And I'm sorry I didn't wear my Elizabethan clothing, but you can't see it, so next time.
And I think there's one more, and that's our Cornell stuff we have to do. So if you want to stop sharing, Connie, we can, if anybody has questions, we're a small group, so you could unmute or you can put your question in the chat for Connie. I think this is fascinating. There's so much.
Just incredible that he used these so beautifully, but obviously he had such exposure to these plants and knowledge of these plants.
Yeah, yeah. And the rue brought back a memory because when I was at Cornell, one of my roommates worked at the botanical gardens there, the plant, whatever they forget what they call it. But she was allergic to rue. If the sap got on her.
Oh, it can be
Yeah,
irritating.
yeah.
And that's why I was shocked that it would be prescribed as medication.
Yeah.
But, you know, I would assume some of those things are still used. I know chamomile, I forgot to mention that they used it as a calming influence. And isn't that the way we use chamomile now?
In tea, yeah.
So a lot of the things that, and when you think of marigolds, I think there's an antiseptic quality. So using it on minor skin injuries or rashes makes some sense. So a lot of the things that they determined to work, I think do work. But some of those I'd be really scared. Like I'm not going to consume rue, and I somehow don't think that certain things are going to help you avoid.
Yeah. Catherine just made a comment. From her research, rue is in many older herb books, but they do state it's toxic.
Yeah.
So I guess that's where you go for the dose. And I guess if a
Right.
doctor's prescribing it.
And based on other programs I've done, very likely some of these remedies were first perfected by women practitioners that weren't physicians.
Right.
We know a lot of things about it. But that's for another day to discuss.
All right. Any other questions, comments? I don't see anything coming in on the chat.
Remember, find me at William Shakespeare Rose.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. Thank you, Connie. This was quite interesting and fascinating. And hopefully we'll see you guys in April. Hope maybe even in person.
Ooh, that would be exciting.
Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm gonna stop.